God. So if I'm a child of God, if I'm loving God by being obedient to Him, following His commands, all things will work together for good. I just don't know what that good is all the time. And he said, to those who are called according to His purpose. The word His is actually added by the translators, but it's to purpose is the literal translation. But in other words, there's a purpose for everything that happens. And that's hard to swallow sometimes, because sometimes the things that happen are not pleasant. And I don't know what the good is in those. I have no idea. And so I have to look at it from this aspect of that will be maybe revealed to me later. Maybe I'm going through something terrible and horrible and awful so that I can help someone else remain strong in their faith later on down the road when they go through something terrible, horrible, and awful. All right. Brother Wood says, the answer of no is grounded in good for us. So it is, he says, and so we should ever regard it. And thus, listen to him, be content with the divine wisdom ever evidenced in such instances. That's from Brother Wood's commentary on James. I think it's interesting how different people have looked at the way God answers prayers throughout the years. Good, sound brethren. And we can learn from them and look at as they look at passages, and then we can look at passages ourselves and know that God is there and that He will answer the prayer. Again, it's not always in the affirmative. Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 20. If somebody will read that. To me, this verse, the way it reads is, we've got to think about it. Just the way it reads, I think is, it's a difficult passage to translate. I went back to the Greek New Testament and read it word for word as it's written in the Greek, and it's definitely, I can see how it's hard to word this properly, I think, and maybe it's just me. Maybe you'll get it right away. 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 20, somebody read that.
For all the promises of God in Him are yes, and in Him, amen, to the glory of God through us.
So what is he saying there? I would suggest to you what he's saying is God keeps His promises. They're not, He doesn't, sometimes keep them and sometimes not. If you look back at verse 19, it says, the Son of God, Christ Jesus, who was preached among you by us, by me and Silvanus and Timothy, was not yes and no, but yes in Him. In other words, it's a positive, always positive. It's not sometimes no and sometimes yes as far as the gospel goes. The gospel is always positive, always yes. Well, the promises of God are always kept. That's what he's saying in verse 20, best that I can discern from the way that it's written. God always keeps His promises. And so God has promised to answer our prayer. The manner in which He answers is entirely up to God. It's not up to me how He answers it. It's not up to you how He answers your prayers. So let's look at a few examples of God answering prayers in the Bible. Let's go back into the patriarchal age in Genesis 20 and verse 17. I want to show you this one. I like that Brother Meadows goes back to the Old Testament to show that prayer has always been there for the people of God. It continues to be there for Christians as well. But Genesis 20 and verse 17, somebody read that. So, very simple verse. And we may just glance over it. Well, Abraham prayed and God granted the request. In this case, what does it show us? It shows us that God listened to Abraham because of his faith and obedience to him. And so that's something I can take and put into my life and say, well, if I'm faithful and obedient to God, He's going to hear my prayer. Again, it doesn't mean He's always going to answer yes. Turn over to the book of Job. I did a personal study and then later taught a class on Job. And it's one of my favorite studies that I've ever done. Job is a great book. It seems like it repeats itself a lot, the pattern of the book and so forth, but I think there's so very much, it's very rich in showing godly principles to us, this particular book. Job 42, verses 8 to 10. Somebody read that, please. Pronounce the names however you want.
Now therefore, take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams. Go to my servant Job and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept him, lest I deal with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord commanded them, for the Lord had accepted Job. And the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before.
So this is, at the end of the book, Job's friends, so-called friends, I would say, have accused him over and over again of doing evil against God, practicing sin, and that's why God punished him, so to speak. And that wasn't the case, and Job knew that. God is speaking to the friends here and telling them, hey, you better ask Job to pray for you. Job does, and God then shows favor on them and Job himself. And I think it's interesting. A little bit of trivia here. You're told about the shortest man in the Bible here in verse 9. It's not Zacchaeus, it's Bildad the Shuhite. Think about it. Shuhite. Okay, never mind. Preacher joke, sorry. Preacher joke alert. All right, let's go to Hezekiah. 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 1 to 6. 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 1 to 6.
In those days, Hezekiah was sick, and near death. Isaiah the prophet, son of Amos, went to him, said to him, Thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die and not live. He turned his face toward the wall and prayed to the Lord, saying, Remember now, O Lord, I pray, how I walked before you in truth, with a loyal heart, have done what was good in your sight. Hezekiah wept bitterly. And it happened before Isaiah had gone out into the middle court, that the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Return and tell Hezekiah, the leader of my people, Thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. Surely I will heal you. On the 3rd day you shall go up to the house of the Lord.
Verse 6.
And I will add to your days 15 years. And I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. And I will defend this city for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David.
I want you to notice the prayer of Hezekiah. Did he ask not to die? In verse number 3. He didn't. He didn't ask that God add years to his life. So God says, I've heard your prayer, I've seen your tears, and God grants him that. But Hezekiah did not ask for that specifically. And I think we have to remember that. Sometimes we just need to pray to God to look down upon us and bless us as he sees fit. And I think that's, in essence, that's what Hezekiah did. He said, I want you to remember how I've walked in your truth and with the whole heart, and I've done what's good in your sight. He was told by Isaiah, and as far as he knew, it was going to come true, that he was preparing himself to die by talking to God the way that he did. He certainly did not want to die, and I think that's something God places within each one of us, a survival instinct. I think God places that in us to want to live, and I think most people think that way. So it's interesting to me that Hezekiah doesn't say, hey, God, I don't want to die. He just says, remember me and the things that I've tried to do to be pleasing in your sight. If our intention is to do it, God knows that, but I don't think there's anything wrong with us telling him, God, I've tried my best to do what you want me to do today. As we say our last prayer of the day. And maybe even throw in there, forgive me if I've done something that I'm not aware of. And if we know we've done something that we shouldn't have done, we should ask for forgiveness for that, certainly. But God, my intention, and especially if it is our intention, and be honest with ourselves, my intention today was to live for you. Pray that I've done that to the very best of my ability today. And if not, certainly we can ask for forgiveness and try again the next day if God gives us that day. Brother Meadows brings out something here, that God grants requests sometimes, even in the time of miracles, where he did not produce a miracle or have a miracle come about. We may look at the example that's given in James about Elijah praying for it not to rain and it doesn't rain, and then praying for it to rain and it rains. Well, how did the rain come about? The rain didn't come about by unnatural means. That's a miracle. Unnatural means. In other words, God causes it to rain and there's not a cloud in the sky. However, if you read that account, and we're not going to go back and read it, but it's in 1 Kings chapters 17 and 18. So I encourage you to do that on your own. Go back and really look at it. How did it rain? Well, it says clouds came from the sea and the rain fell. So God caused it to happen, most likely, yes. But how? Through natural means. Sometimes God works through just a natural course of events. God is working behind the scenes. Again, how? We don't always know. But we can look and maybe at different times in our own lives and think, was that God working? Very possible. Very possible. All right, I want to look at this next example. David prayed that God would turn the counsel, and this is one I struggle with, of Ahithophel into foolishness. David then did what he could. God overruled and answered the prayer, but there was no supernatural sign. God did it, but we don't know exactly how. In this account, again, we're not going to read it all because it's a lot of chapters, but 2 Samuel 15:31, and then verses 32 to 34, chapter 16:23, and chapter 17:7 and 14. So there's a lot of verses there. Again, I can give these to you if you want to do your own study on this, but it's from 2 Samuel. God works in our lives, but it's not. People sometimes say, I want to see a sign, I want to see a miracle. Remember, Jesus said the people did ask for signs, they asked for miracles. And we don't need that. We have God's entire revealed word to us, his Bible. We also have the natural things that we can look at and see that the design of nature demands that there's a designer. And that's a proof that God is who he says he is. Romans chapter 1 says, we are without excuse to know that there is a God of heaven. The Lord told the Christians at Jerusalem, what did he say? Pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. When he was talking about getting out of Jerusalem when they see the signs that Jerusalem is about to be destroyed. God answered that prayer, but there's no evidence that it was a miraculous thing. But God did answer that prayer because they paid attention to what Jesus had said for them to pay attention to. So God answers our prayers sometimes by saying yes, doesn't he? He grants what we request because it's good for us to have a positive answer, and it's in harmony with his will. It's only when those two things are in sync that God answers yes. So we have to remember that. Sometimes he grants our requests not because it's good for us, but because we insist on having it. And he goes back to 2 Samuel chapter 8. And I want to look at that one real quick. We're given the idea of being persistent in our prayer from Jesus also in Luke 18, when he gives the example of the woman coming to the judge over and over again. 2 Samuel 8, beginning in verse 1. Now after this, it came about that David defeated the Philistines, subdued them. David took control of the chief city from the hand of the Philistines. He defeated Moab, measured them with the line, making them lie down on the ground. He measured 2 lines to put to death, 1 full line to keep alive. The Moabites became servants to David, bringing tribute. Then David defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to restore his rule at the river. David captured from him 1,700 horsemen, 20,000 foot soldiers. David hamstrung the chariot horses, but reserved enough for 100 chariots. And when the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David killed 22,000 Arameans. Then David put garrisons among the Arameans of Damascus, and the Arameans became servants to David, bringing tribute. And the Lord helped David wherever he went. David took the shields of gold which were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem from Beta and from Berothai, cities of Hadadezer. King David took a very large amount of bronze. Now when Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated all the army of Hadadezer, and I think this is not the passage that Brother Meadows intended to give us, but that was an interesting account. Here we go. It's 1 Samuel 8. That makes more sense. This is where the request had been made for a king. And Samuel did not want to fulfill that request. But God tells him to do it. Because the people kept insisting to have a king and insisting to have a king. God granted that request. Why? Why did he do that? Why didn't he say, no, you don't need a king. I'm your king. I'm God. I'll take care of you. You don't need a king. He gave it to them, I think, to teach them a lesson. That sometimes when you ask for things and you get it, it's not for your good as much as you thought it was. And I think God taught them that lesson. So I apologize I didn't look at that ahead of time. 1 Samuel 8. And God gave the request for them to have a king. He told them what was going to happen. And it did happen exactly how God said it would happen. But he let them have that request. That may have been the beginning of the downfall of Israel, children of Israel turning away from God. God granting this request. But it was necessary for all the other things to happen that were in the future. Again, God causes all things to work together for good. So even this request that we may at first glance say, why did God give that to them? Well, if you look at the way the rest of the Old Testament unfolds, and God is revealing a little bit at a time how he's going to bring the Messiah about, this was part of the plan. This was part of the plan. So I think it's very interesting. All right. James 4, 1-4 tells us that God does say no sometimes because we ask with the wrong motives, and we ask, the King James says we ask amiss. Other translations say we ask with the wrong motives. We have to ask according to God and not according to his will. He talks about that we, in James 4 and verse 3, you ask, do not receive. Why? You're asking with the wrong motives. You want to spend it on your own pleasure. You want the things God to grant you requests so that you can be happy. And that's not always good for you. For God to grant your request just because you're asking for it. So sometimes he will say no. And sometimes he will say, wait a while. Remember, I gave the example earlier, Paul wanted to go to Rome. And God granted that request, but it wasn't in the time frame that or rather the Apostle Paul wanted it to happen. All right, I want to end with this thought. All the things that we've studied about prayer, I want you to really think about your own prayer life as we go into 2025. One of the reasons that I've put such an emphasis on prayer is not just for you, the benefit of you, but also my own benefit. I want to be a better prayer warrior, so to speak. I want to be someone that is known as someone who talks to God often, who He always knows us because we're His child, but I'm not an absentee child of God. And what I mean by that, a lot of times we think of someone who's absent is when they don't come to services. God looks at us in our everyday walk of life. Have I included God in my life each day? Every day. I should have an active prayer life, one that is full. I'm willing to talk to God at any time, any moment. I anticipate talking to God. Maybe I'm talking to someone else, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I'm going to pray to God about this conversation. I'm going to pray to God for this person for a particular thing. I'm going to pray. I can't wait until I have an opportunity to stop and say a prayer to God about whatever is going on in my life. It doesn't matter what's going on. I think that fulfills what Paul talked about in 1 Thessalonians 5, 16, 17, and 18. To rejoice always and pray without ceasing. And in everything to give thanks, for this is the will of God. If I'm a prayerful person, I think my faith grows. I think I draw closer to God because that's a way that in my walk with Christ is increased and it's amplified in my mind and in my life. So I've done this study this quarter as much for myself as for any of you. But I hope that the result of this is that we take prayer seriously. All of us, myself included. I want to talk to you. This last thing I want to say to you is God will bless us every day. But it's up to us to live for Him in order to receive the spiritual blessings that are in Christ. I've got to remain faithful every single day. And we get that. All of us understand that. All of us know that. But to practice it is sometimes difficult because all of us are busy and we get busy. And there's things that we will forget unless we make it a priority. So please make prayer a priority in your own life. I covet you praying for me and my family, and I will continue to pray for you and your families. I think it's so important that we keep each other in mind, but certainly that we keep God in mind. So I hope this has been beneficial to you this quarter. Continue to study it for yourself. Think about what God wants you to do as far as your prayer life is concerned. And maybe that's one of the things you think about as you try to make changes maybe in 2025. But please don't wait for January 1st to start praying more. Start today. Don't wait. Start today and just continue it throughout the rest of this year and on through your life. Be a prayerful person. Be someone known as a prayer warrior in that regard. Thank you all for your kind attention today.